So you're really gonna tell me you knew you'd end up here, but you didn't think you'd end up like this? With a bag over your head? Come here. Come here. It's like telling me Boone doesn't even know. He knows. So here's the thing. You thought you weren't gonna end up here with a bag over your head, but here you are. And you still haven't told me a thing about what you know. So what do you know? About what? You're not leaving here. You're not getting this off your head until you tell me what you know about why your brothers that look exactly the same overseas got 330 horsepower and you end up here with 240. Not to mention no individual throttle bodies. Even he's laughing. No, I'm just kidding. We're just repainting the strut towers. We got these reinforcements on here, and it was a lot of work. But anyway, that was fun. Right, Boone? Come on. So these sights are what we were left with after removing the engine from the car. Finally, it was time to designate effort into cleaning this stuff up, and I was super excited about that because aside from getting dead bugs out of my ECU cabin, a clean car that is the project car can keep motivation high. And when stuff looks like this and there's a lot of hours in cleaning left, it's not quite as motivating. So one big theme of this episode is going to be faulty order of operations, and I'll get into that later. But one thing that wasn't wrong was using turtle wax, bug, and tar to clean up these strut towers. Great for old oil and mess. What I was doing here was prepping and sizing up the surface for welding on these reinforcement pieces. So the shock towers and E36s are well known to crack with too much stress, and I didn't want to have to deal with that. So all I'm doing here is prepping this metal for a mobile welder to come weld these in. Turns out the day of my appointment, he texted me and said he broke his arm dirt biking, so that didn't end up happening, and these sat exposed for many months until a couple good friends were able to come and help me weld these in. There's Sean. Here's Jantz. It's our shop teacher. He's got his glasses on. So again, many months later, these two dudes came over and saved the day. Sean Bandley and Jantz Christiansen, each doing help with metal prep and welding specifically. So after removing the gas tank for safety, Jantz got onto the R-tabs, the rear trailing arm bushing plates, which I didn't really get very many shots of. That's before, and there's the plate. But yeah, he took those on, did a great job. He called himself a grinder, not a welder. He got it on there, we ground it down, and it looked great. And then up front here again, we have these strut towers. This is gonna be a job for Sean. So originally we had prepped these with a weld-through primer. It was this copper weld stuff that theoretically you're supposed to be able to weld through, which I did use on the rear subframe, but I think with TIG it just doesn't work that well. So we ended up grinding down some of the areas that we'd be welding on and leaving as much as possible. Again, that stuff is specifically just for bare metal that's going to be sandwiched and can't be painted in the future, just to avoid rust, because you know we hate rust. Sean and Jantz then helped take on these front ones. Sean TIG welding and Jantz making sure the car didn't start too much on fire, because yes, it did start a little bit on fire in the strut towers, using a wet towel there. Sean was super nervous about this because he's such a sweet guy, and this did take some time late into the night, but it did turn out really, really well, and that did show his patience and taking his time, the effort he's put into this, and it's going to be such an awesome centerpiece for this engine bay. So again, to these guys, a rare two that you don't come across in your life that often that are that willing to help and to do such a great job. So thank you guys. And I'm a guy that you don't cross too often because of how funny I am.
Wait, is this a video?
Got us off guard, dude.
You're killing me, dog.
It's 1 a.m.
Doing our best.
Go home.
Getting them done.
Next on the agenda was repainting the engine. After this came back from the machine shop, a bit more rust had been showing under the original coating, and this is definitely a while you're in their job or while it's out of their job. So A bunch of masking ensued to prep this for paint, and then after that it was time to remove the freeze plugs, because again, this is the easiest to do while it was there. They were the original freeze plugs, and why not while you're in there also just to get the beautiful zinc coated new ones in there. So after removing those just by displacing them, I picked Boone's ball up and threw it out of the window so that he could properly fetch the ball and I could get this job done right as a team. After that, next up was JB Weld. This was high heat stuff that can handle bajillions of degrees, much hotter than an engine can get. Although this felt weird to be using JB Weld on my engine, that's what the smart people that I ask all my questions to, aka Mike Wetzel, told me to do. I then proceeded to reinstall these, trying to use an old freeze plug just for the perfect size to try to make all the hammering even as I put them in. What I ended up doing was just hammering them directly in the middle of the freeze plug, which seemed, using a flat enough hammer, to not deform them at all. Insert them evenly to the same depth as before, hammering not too hard, and they installed seemingly great. So if you want to get a bunch of likes on your Instagram post of your half-built engine, not only do you need new zinc freeze plugs, but you need some fresh paint. So it was time to get this thing prepped for new semi-gloss black paint. I had to show, one of the main tools I ended up using was just a hammer and a tiny chisel for all the little intricate areas, as well as just wire brushing the rest. So a bunch of rust or oxidation you can still see is left over, but that is something we can deal with the chemical process before we paint it. So one half is already done, and the next day I took on the second half here, as well. This is a little bit better visualization of me using the chisel to get things started. Still funny to look back on this, but it just ended up working the best, so we went with it. And on to the painting materials of choice, thanks to Mikey Wetzel. So if it fails, it's all your fault, dude. Pour 15 for both metal prep and for the paint itself, for the engine enamel per se. So the first process here, you can see me sanding a few areas that didn't have to get cleaned off and then cleaning it up. This is a metal prep solution that I had to apply for 20 minutes straight, not letting it dry. And then the weirdest part of it all is rinsing it with water.
Weird as fuck.
So my half-built engine I got to spray with the garden hose. Kind of weird. Anyway, from there I dried it off, finished some of the plugging for some of the small holes that you see there with cut up earplugs, and it was on to the engine enamel part of this. And here's where one of my mistakes of this episode is put on blast. So this stuff says apply thin layers. I did not apply thin layers. And though it looked awesome the night before and I was super excited, I knew this obviously had to dry up a little bit because it was going to be semi-gloss and this is still very wet. The next morning I was a little sad. So in the end of the process, for one, I wasn't too surprised to see drips because again, I put it on pretty heavy. But the weird thing was it dried unevenly based off of little touch-ups I did while it was still quite wet. So there seems to be a arc or whatever you want to call it based off of how long or how far along it is while drying, that if you go back and touch it, even if it's still wet, and apply a little bit more for touch-ups in thinner areas, it seems to dry a little uneven. So a little bit of a bummer here, but in the end, again, this is just the side of an engine, and I came up with this great theory on how to mask this and not worry about it and make it hard to see. And that's simply by assembling this engine and putting it in the engine bay, at which point you won't really be able to see it that well, especially given the angle that I'm kind of emulating here, not being able to see the details so well, but 50,000 things are going to be in the way of this thing. So soon after I realized that, the cares decreased a lot. So as this car had been sitting for quite a while, I had a few months of dust to blow off as I try to consistently keep it clean, but that's just what happens sitting in a garage. It was time to mask this car for doing some paint, and that paint was going to be for the strut towers. And this is where I will remind you the mistakes of mine kind of continued in certain ways, and that is in the cleanliness of this job and having to do it multiple times. Spoiler alert. So as you can see here, and I hate even looking at this now in the editing studio, but the bottom of the struts are still very dirty and not ready for paint at all. It's not going to create a good job. It's not going to adhere. And I think my theory here was, oh, I'm just painting the top of the struts. The paint is not going to go that far down the struts. I'll be able to sand everything, get to where the dirt was, because the tops were prepped well, at which point it'll be clean, enough of a job, adhere well. The bare metal will be covered so that when I go to clean the rest of the engine bay, water doesn't get on the bare metal, even though I'm totally down to spray my half-assembled engine with a garden hose. And from there, it'll be totally fine. So this is where you can start to see the hint that the paint actually goes pretty far down those towers. So after priming it, it was time to do seam sealer. And again, this just piled on the anxiety and the problem. So these little valleys didn't get welded. They were hard to weld. So I decided just to do seam sealer. I went heavy on this and the stuff dries weird. It's really sticky on your fingers. I tried the method with a wet finger and soap. It didn't quite work. And that looks so bad, dude. These ones don't look bad at all. The R-tabs look fine, but the strut towers just packed it all on, and everything about this just made me feel like absolute shit. Even the spray can wanted to do bad things to itself. It was malfunctioning. It was not happy. So many days later, after cooling down, it was time to do this all over again. So for one, the seam sealer had not dried. I didn't really understand it, but I put it on so heavy and it was so sloppy. And also two, aside from this not being a good job, I was super bummed to have hidden Sean's amazing TIG work on this. These plates are really pretty to see, welded so nicely on the top. And once I removed that gobs of seam sealer, I actually realized I had enough still left in the seams as is, almost totally cleaned out, but sealed off well enough that I could just paint it as is, seemingly making the plates look as they did in bare metal, left with the beautiful welds on display and good to go. So, you know, all is now well for the most part. It was time to peel this plastic off the car, not knowing I would actually do it one more time on the driver's side because it was still a little bit dirty, but at least the progress is in the correct direction. We'll be back to that. And then from here, it was time to pull the masking on the stickers. Could have done a little bit better job on the white sticker on the left side. You see a little dirt left over. And although it's not always great to be proud of painting around stickers, I totally would change this in the future, peel the stickers and put new ones on. Something about the anxiety when you're impatient and you're nervous and you just make stupid decisions without thinking. It's a human condition. I did it. I'm here to use this car, so it's okay, and I'm not going to worry about it. So bugs are cool, but I was low-key pretty stoked that that grasshopper was no longer living where my ECU belongs, and after blowing a bunch of stuff out, this is how much stuff came out of the car. Of course, there's glitter in it. That seems to never end. But before cleaning the rest, I decided to coat my fresh paint with the Hybrid Solutions Ceramic Graphene Flex Wax. Again, with this being fresh paint and me about to be using cleaning chemicals around the engine bay and dirt and all that flying everywhere anyway, wanted to make sure it was nice and protected just to avoid any stains on the fresh paint. So first up, we used Turtle Wax's Bug and Tar, which is great again for agitating any loose dirt and soils. Then moving on to using the pressure washer. Started here by hand, which is always great, but this engine bay has a lot of sharp edges and stuff, and ultimately the pressure washer is going to be the thing that we needed to use. So moving on to the rest of the engine bay, you'll see on the driver's side here as well the edge of paint on that strut tower that I end up needing to have to paint again, but we'll get that in a minute. Moving on, next up we had wheel wells, and I had a couple questions and ideas in cleaning this, namely if these were supposed to be body color or not. I've had a few old BMWs that they are body color, and moving to the E36 chassis I wasn't fully sure, so I decided the perfect product for this was going to be Turtle Wax's Hyperfoam Wheel and Tire Cleaner. This stuff does a great job at pulling out that difficult to remove brownness from dirty tires. So it became apparent after cleaning a lot that someone had used black bed liner or black rubberized coating in here before. It was perfectly in the shape of the wheel well that wasn't covered by the plastic molding that I had taken off. And then also just to compare it to the rears, aside from the stuff you'll see near the welded piece that I put on, it was apparent after scrubbing all this stuff that these are supposed to be body colored. So these took a few scrubs because some areas were tougher than others. But there was nothing near the blackness or paint-like quality as the front. These are supposed to be body color, and that got me really excited. So all things considered here, while you're in there, while the car's up in the air, I knew I had to again go back to paint because those front wheel wells were just not the desired output that I wanted. And this brings me back to what I brought up at the beginning of the episode and a couple failures in order of operations. If this was a case that I decided to clean the entire car before grinding into the metal and exposing metal, then this would be a totally different situation with having to paint multiple times. The job would be done better. I would only have to paint once, but again, this is all hindsight and it's okay. As I jump into the full cleaning of the underside of this car, aside from how awesome it did turn out, one thing I had to mention is you need to wear gloves. Near the end of this, my skin started tingling, and 2 hours of scrubbing and using cleaning stuff that's normally meant for wheels and tires, yeah, you should probably wear gloves. So just a disclaimer there, I did it wrong. Once again, impatient Sam doing his thing. So the underside is totally clean now. The exterior and top side was dusty, dirty, and needing a little bit of extra cleaning, including a message written on my windshield. So it was time to move to one of my favorite products, and one of 2 products that actually has my photos on it, both of a Corvette that was originally blue. It's 3-in-1 ceramic detailer. So this stuff is meant for cleaning a car that's not that dirty, because I have consistently used this, cleaning off all this dust, getting it back to a nice clean shine, and resetting the top exterior now to match the cleanliness of the underside of the car. How rare is that to have the top side have to catch up to the bottom? So here's some over stylized shots of me getting that clean and getting my stoke cleaned up too. So check this out. The exterior is looking nice and clean, and if we take it to the back here, the underside is looking nice and clean as well. Though there were a couple things, again, still sticking out. Those R-tabs and their welded pieces with new coating that I had put on still being black, and those front wheel wells with their blackness from a previous owner as well. I debated heavily if this and the shots that you're seeing right now would be the end of this episode. It's not. And in the end, although there was a great transition between what you see here and before, I decided this wasn't quite it. So we'll get back to that in a moment. So next up was an assortment of parts that needed cleaning before they went back in the car. We have these 2 differentials, both limited slips, one a 315 and one a 338. The 338 obviously coming from my car. And then the manual transmission that came from the donor 328 from the second episode. This thing was nasty from the heat shielding in the transmission tunnel having disintegrated all over it. Next up was M52 and M50 manifold. Didn't know what I was picking at this point. Brake calipers, shifting parts, oil pan, heat shielding, so on and so forth. So first up in this situation is just blasting with the pressure washer, getting most of the stuff off. These differentials honestly weren't that dirty, especially for a 300,000 mile unit. But moving on past the pressure washer, we were going to go back to Turtle Wax's bug and tar. So getting the initial scum and disintegration and all this stuff off the transmission. Next up was soaking this stuff in that bug and tar solution, getting to brushing it, and then back to the pressure washer to see how well we could get this thing cleaned off. So for these wheel calipers, I use one of my latest favorite products from Turtle Wax, which is the Hybrid Solutions Pro Rapid Decon Wheel Cleaner, which can also be used as an iron remover safely on paint. But this turns all the brake dust pink, helps me dissolve it, and again, turns these things from black back to silver, and it's pretty rad to make it that easy from this product. The next day here, I got a good look at the transmission in the sunlight, and although this does have a little bit of muddling from some oxidation and it isn't perfect aluminum to be seen, the transition here is pretty nuts from before and after, and this is going to look great with the very clean underside of this car as well. And next up on the to-do list for this transmission is going to be replacing the detent pins in this for clean shifting. On the inside of the bell housing, little bits also for shifting and clutch parts. And on the back, more shift linkage and the rubber guibo. So that'll be in another mechanical episode coming soon. So you guys want to see some more parts cleaning or what? Because I got you. We got the fuel tank that needed just some dusting off, and I ended up spraying as well to get that nice and clean before it goes back in and never sees any daylight again. Next up were more aluminum parts, these from the engine bay and the oil filter housing and the power steering pump. Started with the pressure washer on these, but there were some oil stains that proved very, very hard, as if they were baked on. Obviously these parts see a lot of high heat sitting right next to the engine and attached to the engine, but this took a little bit more work using screwdrivers and steel brushes. But with enough testing between the turtle wax products and scrubbing, we got these nice and cleaned up and we're able to move on to the washer fluid reservoir as well. This plastic part is actually really expensive, brand new, and not something I felt like purchasing again. So lots of scrubbing here, and that got taken care of. And then moving on to hardware, of course, bolts that can be reused, just a little bit of scrubbing, ready to be installed. And then moving on to the voodoo magic, not of bug and tar, but of an S52 engine, the Vanos unit. So I tested a little spot here with bug and tar, as you can see on the right, nice and clean. On the left, what it looked like before. So the interior side of this, the side that's facing inside the engine, was a little bit baked on, but not too bad. Did 2 sessions of scrubbing here. And at this point, when I was cleaning this, I didn't feel like getting this in the pressure washer because I had never actually opened one up before. So I just used a spray bottle over a garbage can, got that nice and clean. And again, back for a second scrub session just to get the final bit of oily grease left behind, as I got the majority of the high spots off before. So cleaned off and looking good there. It was time to move to the nastier outside bit that saw lots of oil leaking and sitting on it. So this again had lots of baked on oil that was very hard on the bottom side of it. But again, with a couple of scrub sessions here, got it cleaned up over the garbage can and finished it off looking real good. I'll let you watch the rest of that instead of me talking you through every single part. Looking clean and ready to go. Yeah, and I can confirm on the inside of this, there's definitely chocolate milk on the inside of that unit. Since this has been recorded, I have replaced the seals on the inside of the Vanos. I did the voodoo magic. I learned how to do it. Very exciting to have been done, but shout out to Bug and Tar for getting this thing cleaned up and ready to alter my cam timing. The plastic sheeting. We meet again for a dance with the wheel wells and other little bits for hopefully the final time. The wheel wells to make them one color again, the strut towers to paint it properly, piece on the frame rail there to paint over since it's exposed metal, and that was sitting as it was. And then obviously the R-tab areas in the rear that I had put rubberized undercoating on and wasn't stoked with how it looked on pitch black against the paint matched wheel wells in the rears. And then first up, post prep for paint is obviously primer, and then I went on to a single stage paint for the wheel wells and underneath in the rear of the car, as those will see a lot more harsh conditions, and then just a base coat in the engine bay as was done from the factory. And then I actually found the first piece of real rust on this car, and that was at one of the jacking points, which totally sucks, but it wasn't that bad. Got it cleaned up. I don't have any shots of it painted, but basically it looks like what it did not painted, but with paint on top of it, so just trust me, dude. Anyway, I will stop the ramblings and just get to a sick-ass montage of everything turning BMW Hellrot red. So getting to install these wheel liners here, they're a little bit beat up, a little crusty. I might replace them in the future. They're about $100 a soda pop, but we'll see if I get to it or not. We'll deal with that later. And as well, you'll be happy to see I did a better job masking these stickers, so no more dirt gap on the left side of that white sticker. Happy all of us. From there, did some touch up below the passenger side strut tower. It was already white from primer there, but this just makes it less of an eyesore and harder to see any spots like that. As well, since it wasn't painted, I decided to do a quick hand polish on that to brighten it up. so it looked a lot more like the freshly painted parts that are very bright red, Hellrot red. Then 2 gave a light hand polish to the freshly painted areas just so any light bits of overspray were cleared up, and it gave it a little bit of a sheen, then followed up by protective graphene ceramic coating, of course. And last but not least, for 2 seconds, but has 40 million screws, is the heat shield on the bottom of the hood. All right, cue the plink plink piano music, because we have a completed episode. So ultimately, I am deciding on the M50 manifold here, per all the pressure of all my friends that told me I'd be so wrong if I didn't do it. So between those two, got them both cleaned up, but decided on the M50. I have the install kit. That will be coming soon. Of course, aluminum parts that all got nice and cleaned up with the assistance of Turtle Wax's many cleaning products, namely Bug and Tar. As well, I didn't show this, but I ended up getting a new steering rack. Although I did clean this a very long time ago with an older bottle of Bug and Tar, I ended up getting a reman unit, so at least the guy that remans these will be happy to get my clean core back. If I ever remember to send it back, that is. And of course, again, more aluminum parts, nice and clean now, ready for install. Moving on, we have the subframes. It's been a while since we've seen these. They had their time getting prepped for welding, getting reinforcements on them, as we saw in previous episode, and again here, now nicely coated. And of course, before I showed these off, I had to get them cleaned up and coated with that Hybrid Solutions Porose ceramic graphene flex wax, which will keep them nice and easier to clean when they get reinstalled. There, we actually have a couple parts that haven't been shown previously, and these are the strut bars. They're from a place called Part Shop Max. The reinforcements on the front strut towers actually came with these strut bars. I wish it said wax in the middle, it'd be more appropriate. They had them powder coated sparkly silver, and the rear is actually a kind that goes through the floor and attaches to the rear subframe for a little bit of extra rigidity. So I'm excited to get these installed and be a race car, totally. Back to the transmission one more time, just some great before and afters. We got some detent pin installation coming up, as well as a few other things, including a Z3 shifter, a DSSR, a tougher brace, and so on. And the final thing that's going to be the big difference, or a reveal, if anything, because it's not really a reveal, is just the lower control arms, which I went to solid steel arms, poly bushings, and so on. As well, the diff, I haven't picked one yet, but I guarantee you I will pick one. So stay tight for that, okay, man? Let's move to the engine bay. These are the final shots. These are the ones I've been waiting to show you. This is it. It's complete. 3 sessions of paint done, and now I'm stoked. I can say it's done. I'm happy. This thing's looking fresh. Everything is coated, clean, no metal exposed anymore. That washer tank looks great. I am proud of this engine bay. Should be strong too. Nice and reinforced. Shout out to Sean for those welds, and Jantz for the towel work. We're moving on. From here, we gotta give a shout out to the products that were used. One is missing here, the Hyperfoam, but Turtle Wax has a great lineup from last year and a great new bunch that just came out at SEMA this year. And the crown jewel of all this, because of those products, is definitely the wheel wells and the underside of this car. Everything came out so nice. I love looking at these before and afters. You'd think I'm listing on BAT with a reserve, dude. Like that's how good this shit looks. And I will not be. I'll be listing on Cars and Bids. Just kidding. I'm keeping this car. So again, as I admire these Hellrot red paint-matched wheel wells, I'm stoked. The whole car is clean and it's ready for parts to be installed. This is a moment that could be underrated in some ways, and I didn't even realize until the car was clean. The motivation is high, and I cannot wait to see this with all the parts reattached, back on the ground, and ready to go. Thank you, Turtle Wax. Thank you, these two hands. Let's keep this thing moving. Turtle Wax, dedicated to the drive.